Good afternoon, Ways and Means. Hope you had a good weekend. Today's February 3rd, Tuesday, 1:15. We are doing our weekly work on the yield bill with Julia, and then are gonna take some testimony on essentially how schools create their budgets as if we are new members on the school board and we're just like learning how it works to really get that like base grounding that we have not gotten before. And then Wednesday, we are spending some time on the governor's proposal around the purchase and use tax. Spending more time on pre-kindergarten. I don't know if folks remember last time we talked about that. We talked about how it might be easier for us to get our heads around all the different factors if we put a proposal on the table. So staff has drafted a proposal with my guidance, but I want to be clear, is not my proposal. It's like a piece of legislation for us to work with. Not my proposal. I'm going to keep on saying it. Great, thank you.
So it's not your proposal.
It's not my proposal. It's just a piece of legislation for us to work with.
Is it Charlie's?
It is.
It's mine, yes.
Because it's just going to be easier for us to work with something tangible. That's tomorrow. And then in the afternoon, we're going to go back to tax classifications. And I know everyone's going to come with all of the solutions that they have. I know Representative Kimball has some really extra special homework on that one. So you will be tested. And then revisiting school construction on Wednesday. And then Thursday, coming back to pre-K and childcare and understanding the strength of that fund, the childcare contribution tax. And then going back to the governor's budget with just the Department of Taxes, like annual ask. That's our sort of responsibility with appropriations, narrower than a lot of other committees. We have a joint hearing with on special education with the Education Committee. We're going to spend more time in the federal link up with a huge stack of witnesses. And then Friday, we're going to hear from some of our colleagues and then come back to regional assessment districts in a fairly similar fashion to how we worked on the tax classification. In other committees, a lot is happening. And I really please do pay attention to the agendas of the committees that you are responsible for. So like, for instance, today at caucus, we had someone mentioned a fee in passing and we were like, oh, didn't know there'd be a fee there. Two that seem to have a lot of action, Representative Wozniak, House General has a mobile homes bill that has a lot of tax policy in it. And then they have sort of a larger housing tools bill that has a lot of tax policy in it. House General. Oh, sorry, GovOps. I meant GovOps. Mark, lottery. I think they're starting to take testimony. That was just like my quick scan through. So really, please encourage everyone else to do a scan through of agendas. Because I'm sure I've missed something. Okay. Anything else? Public service announcements? Birthdays coming up? So many visitors in the building today. Okay. Julia, do you want to join us?
Yeah.
Thanks. Similar to how I said the pre-K language is not my proposal. The scenarios that Julia is taking us through are also not my proposal. I asked her to put together a few sort of extreme examples of how we could apply the governor's recommended buy down or general fund transfer in order for us to understand sort of the implications of the scenarios. Are there any more caveats that I said I was going to make?
Not that I can remember. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There are three documents on the committee page under my name. Two, you've seen many times before, the annotated guide of the Education Fund Outlook to remind you what exists in each of those lines. And the other being the yield bill decision points. The last document is new to today, and that is the education fund outlook that Chair Kornheiser was referencing with a number of different scenarios. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Madam Chair, do you want me to start with the outlook or do a review of the yield bill decision points?
I would love a review of the yield bill decision points because that's sort of what we're going to exercise.
Okay. So I don't know how to answer that question. I didn't bother to update the date on this slide deck because it's the exact same one that we walked through before. So as a quick reminder, the yield bill, this is a Ways and Means bill every year that determines how to raise sufficient funds for the education fund after summing up all uses out of the ed fund and then subtracting out our non-property tax revenues. We know that funds can be raised from other revenue sources, one-time money, for instance, can be raised from homestead property taxes and non-homestead property taxes. How that ed fund is filled is a policy choice. So these are some of the high-level questions, decision points that you all are grappling with as you consider the yield bill and are looking at the education fund outlook each week. Non-property tax revenue. Should one-time money be used to lower property taxes? If so, how much? Where is it directed to? Should ed fund current law non-property tax revenues be changed? Recall that any change to a revenue stream doesn't necessarily mean immediate full returns on that change. There is usually an administrative rollout timeframe. And to that end, should new revenues be added to the ed fund? You then have the question of property tax revenue. How much should be raised on homestead property tax and how much should be raised on non-homestead property tax? Usually that's thought through by looking at the average bill change across those different classes. So how much is the homestead bill, average tax bill increasing? How much is the average non-homestead tax bill increasing? Should they be different? Should they be the same? Also a policy decision. Then you have the question of income sensitivity. How should the property tax credit be calculated for the following year? Recall that the property tax credit is on a lag, meaning that the property tax credit earned for fiscal year 27 is going to be applied to FY 28 tax bills. Same is true. So when we're looking at the FY 27 column in the education fund outlook, we're looking at the property tax credit that was earned in FY 26. So if we want to adjust income sensitivity in the upcoming fiscal year, we need to address the credit that's already been earned. We also, or you also need to look at setting the income yield. How is the property tax credit going to be calculated next fiscal year? And then other decisions, these are a couple, of course, there's more. Should education fund expenditures be adjusted? Of course, the more expenditures, the more revenue that needs to be raised. The lower the expenditures, the less revenue that needs to be raised. And then the question of reserves, should funds be reserved for a certain purpose or no purpose in future fiscal years? That's both the additional reserves and the stabilization reserve. So those are the high level decision points. Shall I move on to the outlook?
I think so.
Okay. So we've officially moved from vertical to horizontal because of the columns. So what we're looking at here as the chair
Bit in your office that you.
a bell. No,
Okay.
but perhaps I should. So what we're looking at here is an outlook, as the chair referenced, of a number of different modeling scenarios. I do want to note before we go through each one of the scenarios that there have been two underlying data changes from the last time that I presented the outlook. Those two changes are the final grand list data from the equalization study from the tax department has now been baked in the background in the yield model. And also we have updated it with the long-term weighted pupil count from the Agency of Education. So FY 26, nothing has changed from the last time.
So does that mean that the only sort of assumption that's still subject to change probably this year is the spending.
Yeah, so yes,
The education payment.
the biggest underlying assumption that still is going to change that won't be reflective of a policy decision will be the education payment. So the sum of the education spending. Yeah.
So, and I know we talked about this last year too, but at this point, is there anything underway to look at reducing spending? Or are we just dealing with a set of assumptions about spending?
I really don't know how to answer that, Representative Holcomb. I think you know what's sort of in play to look at that, but right now we're looking at how we set the tax rates.
Well, actually, I don't, because we've talked about a number of possible things that could be done that would take cost out of the ed fund that isn't education cost. And a number of federal drivers, and it's unclear how we're going to respond to those. So I didn't know if those discussions are happening.
I think many of them are happening and they're happening in other committees, but we can. Back to you, Julia.
Okay. So the data updates, none of those are impacting FY 26. This is the same column we've already looked at. We're seeing those changes, underlying changes in FY 27. So this is really using the December 1 letter assumptions and all of the data updates since then. So solving for a uniform average bill change, assuming the stabilization reserve is fully filled, using all of our updated data. And this column is consistent with the assumptions that were used for the emergency board modeling. It's really just showing the differences with the changes to the long-term weighted pupil count and the grand list. And what you're seeing here is that while there have been some shifts to the general tax rates, which makes sense because we are adjusting the base that the tax rates are being adjusted against, the underlying distribution of weighted pupils and grand list growth didn't really change between the December 1 letter and the final data that we've put in, which is why the uniform average bill change remains at 11.9%, assuming that those December 1 letter parameters.
I have a question. Julia, am I not remembering correctly, but I remember in the old days, there being something about a part of state law, which I haven't been able to find in the last 4 months, maybe, that said something about the tax obligation wasn't supposed to be more than 3% of the taxpayer's income. Do you remember anything like that?
I don't know, and that would be a question for Ledge Council who we have in the room. I don't know if he can.
I didn't catch the very beginning, sorry.
So I remember from the old days, a caveat that 3% was the limit anyone should be paying on their income. But it was when the bill first came through, so it might have been,
Like when Act 60 first came through?
2003 or 4 or 5, somewhere back in there, those days.
Sure.
Do you
So,
remember that?
hi, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I don't, but I can look at the early acts if you just want me to.
I'd like to be reminded of that history and how we got where we are today.
On paying on income.
Yeah,
Thanks, Representative.
don't, John, I know you guys are crazy busy.
That's okay.
Once you get to 45 minutes on this, stop.
Perfect.
Representative Dunn.
Yeah, my recollection is that the 3% has to do or had to do. The original way that we were to look at income sensitivity with Act 60, way back near the beginning of time. But I don't know where it's gone since then. I mean, there have been changes and John could
So this may be excavated.
excavated, in 45
I'm just trying to be nice to you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm glad that we have all this institutional memory. It's actually very helpful to remember sort of the intent behind how we got some of these places again. Julia, source yours again.
One note related to that, JFO's Fiscal Facts does have an entire chapter dedicated to the history of the property tax adjustment. I don't think it has that specific piece, but if you're interested in looking at, see Representative Kimball is showing it. There is a section, so if you're interested in looking at how certain thresholds may or may not have changed over time. That's a nice quick cheat sheet of history.
Here's fiscal back, 26.
Those have not yet been published. We're still finalizing those, but it exists in the 2025 fiscal facts.
Thank you.
I think someone's gonna hand it to you soon, Representative Brannigan. What column are we on?
We just talked about B, which is more of a reminder column. And so now we're moving into those different scenarios that are illustrative of how different pieces would work.
Just folks, I think we're probably gonna eliminate column A the next time we look at this. Oh, sorry, that's 26. Great. Okay. I thought you had December 1st still, but you don't.
No.
Okay, great. I'm glad.
Okay. So column C, this is taking the one-time 105 million from the general fund and dedicating it to uniformly lower property taxes. This doesn't include the purchase and use and one-time backfill or purchase and use swap. It's just using the 104.9 million of general fund. We see that showing up here in line 8 in sources. So that's 105 million of revenue that doesn't need to be raised for the property taxes. And using that amount, we then solved for the property yield, the income yield, and the uniform non-homestead rate for an average bill change to be the same across all three classes. And that would result in an average bill change of 5.8%. So that's if the 105 were to be used in 1 year to lower property taxes uniformly, that's what it would look like. That's what we're seeing in column C.
And just to be clear, the 105 is in addition to the 22 million of surplus down in line 37, the unreserved, unallocated. So it would be closer to 127 million that we're actually talking about putting toward next year's taxes.
Yes, thank you. So that's an excellent point. We see here the 22 million, that's the education fund surplus that would be used to uniformly lower property taxes. And then in addition to the 22 million of ed fund surplus, we're also using 105 million of general fund one time. So in terms of one-time money from both funds, yes.
Portia, can you ask them to? Thank you. In the other columns, have you applied the prior year uniformly? Okay.
Yes. So in all of these scenarios, the 22 million of ed fund surplus has been used to uniformly lower property taxes. That's column C. Moving on to column D. Column D is showing us if what the 105 million of one-time general fund were to be used to lower homestead property taxes, not adjust non-homestead property taxes. And what we see here is that if the 104.9 million of one-time general fund were used to lower homestead property taxes, that the average homestead property tax bill would decrease in fiscal year 27 by 1.8%.
And to be clear, this isn't like a refundable. Can't wait to hear what you're gonna say. It's not gonna be it's not like a refundable income tax credit. Like people aren't gonna get money back. It's just that their taxes are gonna go down.
Exactly. So it'll be, well, this is a comparison of a bill. So they're just gonna have a lower bill than they had in FY 26 on average. And here I also solved the income yield to reflect the property tax credit to be calculated to the same scale as this decrease in average homestead liability. It's important to note this is, of course, C, D, and E are all a one-time buy down. So this would be a one-time decrease of 1.8% on average per homestead. So moving on. D, we looked at the 104.9 million were to be lowering homestead liabilities. E looks at if the 104.9 million were to lower only non-homestead liabilities. Recall non-homestead is everything that's not a homestead and is subject to education property tax. So this is everything from apartments to second homes to offices to parking lots. So what we see here is again, the 104.9 and the homestead and income on average bill would increase by 11.9%. And the non-homestead average bill would increase by 0.3%. This too is a 1-year impact.
And the fact that the homestead sort of was able to go down and the non-homestead is just going up a little bit, is that reflective of the different grand list?
Exactly. Yeah, because the non-homestead grand list is larger, and you can see we take a larger share of property taxes from non-homestead traditionally. That's exactly the reason why. Moving on. Column F. This is if we were to use the 104.9 million to increase the property tax credit. And so again, recall that the property tax credit is on a lag. So if you want to increase the property tax credit that folks are seeing on their property tax bills in fiscal year 27, you need to adjust the credit that was earned in fiscal year 26. And so what we see here is the entire 104.9 million is dedicated to increasing property tax credits. And if all of that 104.9 million were to be used to increasing property tax credits, and homestead and non-homestead were not to receive any of that buy down, property tax credits could increase by 78%.
78% more than last year.
Correct. No, 78% compared to what was earned in FY 26. So 134.2 million was earned in property tax credits in FY 26 to be applied to FY 27 bills. And that's what we're seeing here, consistently in line 1B. Here we see that bump in column F, and that's really just reflecting the 134.2 plus the 104.9.
Can you help us understand what that means for people's bills?
And when?
So when FY 27, what it means for people's bills is, so you'll recall that somebody's property tax bill, homestead property tax bill, if they're income sensitized, is calculated by their homestead liability minus their property tax credit. So what we would see here is someone's homestead tax bill, the amount calculated based off of the value of their homestead, would be increasing by 11.9%. The property tax credit that they earned in the prior year would be increasing by 78%. So their homestead bill would be increasing, but their property tax credit would be significantly increasing. And what that would mean for the different, what that would mean on someone's tax bill would really vary by household, because it would depend on how their household income is in relation to their homestead property value. But
So if they don't qualify for the property tax credit because of income or the value of the property, then they won't, those folks will not see a reduction in the property tax bill.
exactly. And I think it's important to note to that is you have some households who are very low income who do not qualify for a property tax credit because it's cheaper for them to pay on property than it is for them to pay on income. So the way the property tax credit is calculated is looking at, okay, how much would you pay on homestead property? How much would you pay on income? If what you would pay on income is less than what you would pay on property, the state's going to credit you the difference in the following year. There are instances where someone's property value may be lower in relation to the tax rate than their income in relation to the tax rate. So in fact, it's cheaper for them to pay on property. And those households would experience an 11.9% increase.
Would fewer households, if that scenario was playing out across households, would fewer households be in that category? Because it would become more expensive for them to pay on property?
Oh, that's interesting. That would depend, that's an interesting question. That would depend on how you would be setting the homestead yield and the income yield for the relationship between the homestead yield and the income yield for the following year. So you're setting the homestead yield and the income yield annually. And the way that this has been solved is that homestead property tax bills on average are going to increase by 11.9%. That's the yield calculation, as well as the income yield, which means that the relationship between the property tax credit calculation will hold true into the following fiscal year. If you wanted a more expansive property tax credit for the following year, that would need to be done by adjusting the difference between the two yields.
Wouldn't it also depend on continued use of one-time money or a change in revenue source? And that's a one-time buy down.
Yes, this is a one-time buy down.
Yeah, Representative Bodie.
Thank you. Do we have data that shows what age groups take advantage of the property tax credits and which areas state geographically do?
So the tax department has an excellent set of tables on its website that shows by town or by county, well, by both, the number of households that receive a property tax credit on average, the size of that property tax credit. I can send that link to Sorsha so that you can look at it. Age, I don't know. I have not seen that, and I'm trying to think of the data set. I don't know. That would be a question for, I can ask tax, I don't know.
No, that we should pay attention to that.
We can ask Jake. It's possible that the data isn't matchable, but it might be. Yeah, Representative Wozniak.
The renter credit is not.
Correct, that's a general fund expense.
Just curious about that too, for homestead versus non-homestead rates go up significantly, that countering the tax on renters, and there's another pool of people besides the property tax credit receivers that indirectly feed into this.
Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
So I heard from the Thetford School Board that last year, expecting a very significant increase in their tax rate, they used local reserves to cushion it. And then after they voted the budget, we cushioned it even further. And now they have an enormous cliff this year. Has DFO ever evaluated whether the choice of application of one-time money and the timing of choice of application of money has an impact on local decision-making?
No, and I think that would be a better question for the school districts and school boards. I can't speak to how they're making their budget decisions.
And I know that we have asked the school boards and superintendents that question in past years, and we can have them and ask them that again. It's an interesting question. Representative Bodie.
Can you review how current use fits into the different scenarios? If there's any change.
How current use fits into the different scenarios. So current use is impacting the amount of revenue that is pulled from certain properties, right? By adjusting their tax liability. So the distribution of property taxes that are covering for the current use tax expenditure is not changing in these scenarios because the underlying system remains the same. Yeah. That took me a minute.
In old versions of your education outlook, it had other lines where you had the property transfer, current use, but it's not on this because we're trying to produce a more summary version of it. right?
Yeah, I think last year I came in with an ed fund outlook that showed
Yeah.
the current use tax expenditure. I could certainly include that line again. It's a little challenging to include in the ed fund outlook because it's included in it's just the shift of who's making up the property taxes, right? It's a closed system. So all else equal, if somebody's paying less in property taxes, somebody else needs to pay more. And if it would be helpful for me to come in next time and include a line with current use tax expenditure or something else, I can certainly include that. It wouldn't impact the high level numbers that we're seeing in the letter summary lines.
Just want to point out that is an excellent comment to make what we just heard from Julia, and a consistent bee in my bonnet that whenever we lower someone's taxes, like for TIFs or CHIP or for current use, somebody else's taxes go up. So it's not equal for all Vermonters. Have I said that enough times, Teddy?
No, I like it.
Okay. I'm sort of hearing myself say that before, as I said that.
I think we all repeat ourselves here. It's part of our charm. And what I will repeat, I think is, and this is, I don't want this entire conversation to sort of move into a conversation about current use, but there is a debate about whether this really is a tax discount or the true property value of that land. And the appropriate valuation of that land. And so like, that's a debate we can also have, not right now, but yeah. Are you about to enter the debate that I just said we're not going to have, Representative Maslin?
Just a comment.
Yes, you are. Uh-huh.
Carolyn's comment about someone goes up, someone go down, which is not necessarily a zero sum game depending on what we're solving for.
Mhm.
It can be very, so anyway, that's true. I agree with you. Okay, good.
That was a great point. Thank you. Truly.
Done. Hey,
Yes, and then.
I'm not having that conversation, except to say that you do have the question that I'm not going to use those CE words, but, or CE words, but the challenge is that, and it's hard to know how progressive or regressive the property tax is relative to the income tax. But when we make decisions about what we fund and where we fund it, we're also having an impact. It is either regressive or progressive. And it feels like we're flying a little blind on that right now, in particular when we don't know where those cuts are.
Yeah. Let's return to our columns.
Okay. We just have one column left. So we just spoke about column F, and then the final column, column G, is a little bit different than the ones that we just looked at. This is if we were to take the 104.9 million in one-time general fund, use a third of it to lower property taxes, and then put the other 2/3 of that one-time money into a tax rate offset reserve or a transition reserve. I use the term tax rate offset reserve because that's what I had used in the past. So this is putting 2/3 into reserve for future years of the one-time money and using a third of it to lower property taxes uniformly in fiscal year 27.
I want to explain a little bit of my thinking and asking to make this column. So one, and I also want to name the amount that she's applying to the general fund transfer is very far from a set in stone number. The Appropriations Committee just started looking at the budget this week. Really have, what?
105 million, I mean.
Yes. They just started looking at the budget this week. Not entirely, it's not clear how much money will be available or won't be available to move to any other funds from the general fund. And we know that our revenues are growing slower each year right now. They're not declining, which is sort of a way that they've been talked about a little bit, but they are growing slower each year. And so might have less money for a general fund transfer next year than we do this year. And as we move forward with Act 73 implementation, we're sort of stuck in this few-year window of these year-over-year transfers that are creating cliffs for the next year that cause panic that, you know, I think we're all familiar with that cycle. And so this is a way of sort of thinking about our work, not just in a single year yield bill, but across sort of a couple year transition. I don't know if it's the right way to do it. The number, like the particular numbers are not a proposal. Maybe it's a combination of all of these columns is what we need to be looking at in some way. Some configuration of them, but just wanted to sort of explain some of the background of why Julia modeled a third. And, you know, an increase of 9.8% average bill change still feels uncomfortably high to me. Any questions or thoughts about this one?
Is this idea of reserving the remainder is that supposed to prevent excess spending?
I will defer to the chair.
I think it's sort of, the excess spending threshold is a different question. I think in some ways, Representative Holcomb's question about how does our decisions about general fund transfers and yield bill affect budgeting decisions? I think to some degree it lays out an expectation of like a promise for a few years rather than a sort of continuing question, hope every district interprets the tea leaves of what we're doing at this table differently. And sort of, you know, everything we do is subject to every, you know, whim and decision each following year, but it sort of sets us on a more consistent path possibly that could, for some districts, say, okay, we know that this is what they're planning, so this is how we'll budget. In both, that could also, like, I think some districts could see that exact thing and say we're going to spend up, and some districts could see that exact thing and say we're going to spend down. Because that's how we, to some degree, wound up in the, you know.
So I was looking at it as an alternative to a spending cap.
Well, that's a whole other proposal. It's not making its way over here
Well, I
yet.
know that, but I just wondered if this was preventive,
Mhm. I think in a natural consequence way, yes, but not in a statutory way.
I mean, if you believe in natural consequences, you don't lie down. Because then people pay higher tax rates, and if they don't like higher tax rates, they lower their tax rates. I think part of the challenge is if we tell everyone they're gonna get a 12% tax rate increase, and then they don't, it's confusing. And because we're interfering in their budgeting. And I'm not saying that we are in a bad situation now, but I think we also help create it.
And this might be getting a little too philosophical, but in a perfect democracy, I think that vision of natural consequences would be true. And I think we're not existing in a perfect participant. And I don't mean perfect in terms of like good. I mean perfect in terms of like sort of definitionally sound and absolutely everyone contributes and participates and understands the consequences of their decisions, right?
I agree, but I also think when 127 was passed and it significantly dropped the tax price, the message is you have more spending capacity.
Absolutely.
So that people are surprised by that increase is just mind-boggling to me because that's what people voted for.
Yeah.
So I just
I think yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And at the same time, if we have, I keep hearing people, we pass bills. Every bill we pass has fiscal consequences for school districts. And so we cannot keep passing legislation and then be surprised when we see tax increases. So I guess that's my point. I don't know how, as a shared body, we're going to try to address that issue this year.
Any other questions for Julia, who has to sit there while we have philosophical conversation? Okay, thank you. Encourage folks to really look at the dynamics of each of these and develop thoughts. None of them are perfect. They're all deeply imperfect, and that is the situation we're in.
Just say, I don't think E has a chance.
Know what home is.
Trying down the non-homestead and
Oh, and only,
homestead rising by 11.9%.
Yeah.
E.
Yeah, it's for illustrative purposes.
yes.
I want to say I really appreciate the case studies because I think it helps people understand the dynamics. So I appreciate that approach in the time.
Representative,
I'm just wondering about G and a reserve for the future. I don't think that reserve might be able to make it till 73 comes into effect because we're going to have such pressure otherwise in the budget with Medicaid cuts and SNAP cuts and other cuts. That maybe, oh, well, there's a reserve, use that to buy down your tax rate next year instead of taking anything from the general fund. I can't imagine something like that.
well, I think that's sort of the idea is that next year there'll be way less general fund available for exactly that reason. And so we would want to reserve this now
For them.
for
Not
that.
because
Yes,
of free, because of
well, both things.
better.
But you can think of it as just one of them if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, but then why not reserve them? And why not keep the
Okay. Representative Lester? Representative Holcomb? Oh, sorry. Oh, Mark, go ahead.
I know this is a tough thing to think about, but how much of our thinking or possible thinking about the future should be contained in what might happen in a bill in the Senate or even in the House in regards to capping costs for a couple of years? I mean,
I think
how serious are we? I mean, should that play a role in our decision whether or not to reserve some of this money or not?
so even in the most, I don't know how much people are following the conversation in the Senate, even in the most conservative versions or the most penalizing versions of what they're working on, we're still going to see spending growth year over year. And so we're still going to have a significant need for dollars the following year if we make a general fund transfer this year. Yeah, Representative Massey.
And consistent with that, Mark, as Rep has pointed out so often, it's good. There are cost drivers that we can't address in this room or over in the other body that the tax bill will be greatly affected by the tax cost drivers regardless of what I think we're doing or keeping spending down to a certain percent.
And if and when the bill gets here, we'll take testimony on whether or not it's a good idea.
Thank you.
Another thing I hope we can get some modeling on from JFO because it might help us anticipate growth in spending. There are significant transition costs associated with mergers. Act 46 spread them over 3 to 5 years instead of doing it in 1 year. And it also paid for them. And then there were merger transition grants and there were tax subsidies that for districts that did it. We're not providing those things up front, which means they're going to come in after the fact because those are real costs. And they're going to, instead of being spread over 5 years, they're going to be concentrated in 1 year. And I'm trying to figure out what the plan is for dealing with that reality.
And that was definitely, some of that I think was accounted for and some of it wasn't and was planned to be figured out this year.
Was it accounted for?
There was a appropriation to AOE for some of the technical assistance side of it, but it didn't include sort of money directly to districts to account for their side of it. And I think that was anticipated to be figured out this year once the districts were figured out.
They're using that on consultants.
I don't know exactly how they're spending it yet.
So one question on this, and I failed to ask it when Julie was in the chair, but this does not reflect the governor's proposal to reduce purchase and use tax by 10 million and they get other general fund transfer of 10 million in.
Since it was just moving money back and forth with no actual impacts on bottom lines, I asked Julie to just skip it because it confused the issue.
Got it, just,
We'll look on that when we take more testimony on that
Yep.
idea. Yep.
And that reserve would sit on line 30 or line 35.
35. 35.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
The school boards and districts see that money sitting there. They'd be tempted to spend.
Maybe,
I think it's also important.
but I think there was someone else before you.
Yeah, I'm interested in the structure of column F. Playing with the property tax credit. I don't think we should put all of our eggs in any one of these baskets. In terms of like putting the whole money towards the property tax credit, the non-homestead or homestead. I'd like to look at like how we can play with those three buckets of relief and see if. Because, yeah, I think that's a very interesting idea, just messing with the other side of the equation, but we don't have to put all of our eggs in that basket, right? We can play with it.
And I think I regularly get questions from members about just applying it to sort of the folks who most need it. And that's viewed as the property tax credit or the income adjustment. And the folks who are, have the lower property value homes that get left out of that, right, like we
Right,
can't
exactly.
talk of them. And so I think that's one of the reasons the extreme examples are helpful, is to sort of remember those folks who get left behind when we do that.
And then I think on the reserve idea, I think it's very interesting, but I do worry about the implications of it. And I think like if we're gonna set a goal that we're going to buy tax rates down to a certain amount, I think we should just name that goal, take that money this year, because we can try to predict all we want. Everything's gonna be so much different next year that we really don't know. So my 2 cents.
I would just think, I think we should be cautious in assuming we know what districts are doing locally. I mean, I was hearing from Jim that the preliminary tax rate increases could be in the 30s this year. They don't want to spend them. They just don't have a flexibility. And so I just think we should, it's not that they want to, and at the same time, there's somebody who's going to get a pretty big tax decrease this year. And they're going to have that need. I just think we should be cautious because the things that may be driving high rates may not be in some board's control.
Right, absolutely.
Thanks. Absolutely. Yeah, Representative Bodie.
So I was thinking, if the idea is to have an offset, if that keeps going forward, reserved for the future, then, and that's in the yield bill, of course, but might we put other cost drivers in the yield bill this year to try to solve going forward? I mean, if there's going to be a cap, if there's discussion about a cap on school spending,
I would prefer we wait for our schools, the cap conversation until we
all right,
have it in
But-
front of us.
okay, then
If at all.
healthcare negotiations.
Yeah.
There's a bill about that out,
Mhm.
and that is a huge cost driver. And if we're concerned about the future and reserves, and there were a change in how that is negotiated, then, and that were to go into the yield bill, that would act like a reserve going forward. It would be something that might go up less in the future. So
So you're saying put cost driver reductions or changes in cost drivers into the yield bill? Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and we would need to gather them from the other committees that are working on them. I don't know if I would call it similar to a reserve, because some districts who feel more comfortable with their tax bills would save that money in one place and spend it in another place, and some districts would reduce their spending from it. And so it's possible that it wouldn't actually save money out of the ed fund overall because of the nature of our local control system. Representative Maslin.
Yes.
I got a nod from Julie on that one.
I
was like, all right, switch sides.
But it doesn't be possibilities. Seem to point out it's really a subject in other committees that we need to dig in. I would say perhaps in considerable depth, where we can solve those problems. And then consider allocating any resources to it. Well, anyway, you get the point.
Hey, I have an idea.
Right.
So everyone is a liaison to a committee. And if everyone could scrub the wall of each committee that they're the liaison to for bills that are designed around reducing costs for education, then we would have a delightful crowdsourced list. And I'm sure there are many policy ideas that are not bills yet, but there are many that are. And it doesn't mean, just because you add to the list, doesn't mean you think it's a good idea. Could mean you think it's a bad idea, but it does have that intent attached to it. Yes, Representative Bodie.
I would love to see that.
Will everyone sign up for that?
Yes, I love that
Okay.
because I want to see all the bills would increase education spending because they're unfunded mandates.
Okay,
Just to prove the point.
okay, but can you also make a list of the other thing? And keep
Can
your
I
list-
also what?
Make a list of the things that are designed
Yeah,
to bring the cost down and
obviously.
keep your list separate,
Up and down.
just separate lists.
Top.
Great. Let's actually just like pull up all the bills that were introduced this session and just
I
look through
know.
all of them. That'll be so much fun.
Serious.
Yeah, I know you are.
It's a lack of knowledge of everybody that if you tell a school to do something, it's going to cost money, which will raise spending and possibly property taxes.
Yeah, no, or, moving purchase and use will also increase property tax. Representative Wozniak, I think you had your hand up, but maybe
No,
lost your, okay. Representative Maslin.
I'm paired up with judiciary. I don't know if there's very much there.
One, sure.
I actually think there is.
There is
Yeah.
actually.
But also, if anybody would like a backup with whatever your assignment is, I'm available.
See what you have to do first.
I think there's actually a decent amount there.
There is actually.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Don't want your mind.
Okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break before our next witness jumps in.
Good.